Well, welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 314. And this time I'm coming to you from the exterior of the Courtyard by Marriott Hotel in Prince George, British Columbia, the gateway to the northern half of the province. And this time I want to talk about a fantastic record by Gabor Szabo from 1968 on Skye Records, Dreams. I have a first pressing of this, which I didn't put in my carry-on to bring to Prince George, but I can promise you sounds excellent. And a shout out to my good friend Sean Moore for slipping me a copy of this earlier in the year. Dreams is one of the most perfect realizations, I think, of the psychedelic impulse by a jazz guitarist, albeit by a jazz guitarist who had done a lot to mash up the sounds of different cultures earlier in his career. It has Szabo's trademark ringing metallic tone and an excellent cast of sidemen. It's not pure jazz, it's not pure pop, it's not really pure anything. It's kind of unique. But I guarantee if you put this on at a party, at least one of your guests is going to say, "Holy smokes, what is this?" In a previous episode on this channel, number 218 to be precise, I discussed Gabor Szabo's early life and his migration to America and the beginnings of his recording career. He was, of course, Hungarian. He comes to America, originally to LA, and then he goes to the Berklee College of Music in Boston. A few false starts trying to get a career going, but then he gets invited to play at the Newport Jazz Festival as part of an international lineup in 1958, and there he meets the drummer, Chico Hamilton. He ends up going out to LA, he joins Hamilton's group, and that quintet then goes on in the early 1960s to really make a pretty big impact and made some great records. It splits up in 1964 or 63, I forget when Lloyd leaves, and pretty soon after, Szabo leaves as well, and he goes to play with Lloyd. But Szabo, unlike Hamilton and unlike Lloyd, always had kind of a commercial impulse to his playing, whereas Lloyd and Hamilton really were, relatively speaking, jazz purists. And this is where an old colleague of Szabo's from the Berklee School of Music pops up, who had similar kinds of predilections, and this is the arranger Gary McFarland, who at the time is working for Verve Records. Their first collaboration is on Verve in 1966. It goes out under McFarland's name, and that's the In Sound. And on the strength of that, the producer Bob Thiel at Impulse Records signs up Szabo to what would be a string of great releases that he would put out on that label. Szabo's debut for Impulse is the now inappropriately titled Gypsy 66, which is a pretty good record, but somehow the pop impulse kind of takes over a little bit, and there are some somewhat regrettable schmaltzy moments on there. But it was still well received, and soon after, McFarland is offered the opportunity to have a bunch of his own compositions performed at Lincoln Center. He writes another composition called Mountain Air, H-E-I-R, which he dedicates to Szabo, and this combined with Gypsy 66 and combined also with Szabo's next record, which comes out in the summer, called Spellbinder, which is a fantastic record. Probably should have reviewed it first, but what the hell, established Szabo as an up-and-coming star, pretty big name at this point in the jazz world in New York. Spellbinder is an interesting record. It's made without McFarland, and as a consequence, Szabo, I think, takes more risks, there's less lush production, and it's a far more exciting album. It's a masterpiece of sorts, and it has a huge influence in the rock world. People like the Doors and Santana are lapping this up, but the influence is going the other way as well, because Szabo is listening avidly to the Beatles, he's listening to Cream, and the whole psychedelic moment is taking root in his mind. As part of that, he's also really digging Ravi Shankar, and he makes his own Indian music tribute album later on in the year, Jazz Raga. So if you're keeping up, that's already 3 records made by Szabo in 1966, and he has a fourth, which is a collaboration with McFarland called Simpatico, which is on the kind of lame and overly lush and overproduced side. So there are some real highs in 1966, but he's kind of all over the map. In 1967, however, his focus really sharpens, and what he does is he hires his first ever performing and recording group, of which he is the formal leader. The first person he brings into the group is a bass player, his old friend and fellow Hungarian exile, Lajos Kabok. He adds a second guitarist, a guy called Jimmy Stewart, who is an experienced session guy from San Francisco with classical training, and a percussionist called Hal Gordon, about whom the internet is pretty silent. The drum chair in the quintet was rarely filled for long. On Dreams, it's filled by that session man supreme and future traveling Wilbury, Jim Keltner. But the really important symbiosis that happens in the quintet is actually between the two guitarists, Szabo and Stewart. And you can really hear this in the 2 records that he puts out on Impulse with the quintet in 1967, The Sorcerer and More Sorcery. So by late 67, Szabo's star is on the rise, his gigs are selling out, his records are selling, he's in a pretty good space, but he felt he could be doing better. And so in early 1968, he decides to form his own record label, along with his regular collaborator Gary McFarland, along with that West Coast Latin jazz titan Cal Jader, and the collective manager for all three of those artists, a guy called Norman Schwartz. And they form a label called Skye Records. Skye Records burns briefly but brightly from 1968 to 1970. I think they put out something like 20 records. Most of those records are by those three principals, by McFarland, by Szabo, and by Jader, including some of their best work, a little bit uneven, and eventually the label is bought out or folds. Anyway, it becomes part of Buddha Records in 1970. Szabo's work was always uneven, and during this period he's also putting out a fair amount of schlock, but he's saving his schlock for Impulse Records rather than for his own label, which I guess was pretty astute. The first record that Szabo puts out on Skye is Baccanal, which comes out in early 1968. And this has a lot of the elements that are on Dreams, but much less perfectly realized and with a much heavier debt to pop covers. There are a whole bunch of pop covers. There's Donovan, there's Bacharach and David, and others. It's good, but it's not great. But now Gary McFarland once again comes back into the frame, with Szabo asking him to participate on and produce his next record for Skye, which is going to be the album Dreams. Tracks for Dreams were made in Los Angeles at United Recording Studios on August 6th, 7th, and 9th, 1968, with overdubs happening in New York a couple weeks later. Szabo, of course, is playing guitar and doing some composing. McFarland is the producer. He's also playing piano and he does the arrangements. And while Szabo's previous record with McFarland was a little bit schlocky, this one absolutely hits a sweet spot. Why? It's hard to know. We can speculate, but in any event, what happens here is that everybody seems to play to their strengths and their weaknesses are not that apparent. We're spared an overdose of overly lush and kind of cloying jazz pop crossovers. What we get instead is McFarland mining a rich vein of music from Argentina in the early part of the 20th century, specifically the work of the composer Manuel de Falla, who wrote a ballet in 1915 called El Amor Brujo, or Love the Magician, which is not really a literal translation, but there you go. So what you get in this record is a near perfect combination of some great classical material, some fantastic psychedelic compositions by Szabo, and some of McFarland's most tasteful arrangements, and just one pop cover. Szabo, of course, is joined by Jimmy Stewart on guitar. It's very easy to tell who's who because of Szabo's very clear and obvious metallic tone. Cabot, Keltner, and Gordon are on drums, bass, and percussion, respectively. George Ricci is on cello, and he's fantastic on here, and Julius Schachter is on violin. Finally, there are three French horn players on here, Brooks Tillotson, Tony Alonge, and Ray Miranda. The cover art is absolutely fantastic for this record. It's actually from the same historical era, the early 20th century, as some of the music that they're using. It's by a guy called John Austin, a British artist. It's kind of a late-stage Art Nouveau piece. Side one starts with Galatea's guitar, and it's kind of hard to say what's the best thing about this track. Is it the guitar? Is it Cabot's great arco bass? Is it the percussion? It's a sensory treat. That's followed by Half the Day is Night, which is an awesome psychedelic track and is, I think, one of McFarland's best ever compositions. Then we come to Song of the Injured Love, which is the first of the two tracks which they take from the ballet by de Falla. This is incredibly beautiful. It's like the soundtrack to the best ever 1960s film adaptation of Shakespeare that never got made. The final track on side one, The Fortune Teller, has kind of a Central European or Turkish or Arabic kind of feel, maybe all three. It's a multi-part composition with some very intense passages. Side two starts with one of the great tracks in this record, Fire Dance, which is the second piece that comes from the ballet. This has got some tremendous playing by Szabo, but I actually think it's Hal Gordon's conga playing which ties this whole piece together. The next track is another really strong track, and it's one of the more rock-influenced tracks. It's The Lady in the Moon. This sees the return of Cabot's great arco bass playing, and then the rest of the song is, well, it swings really hard, and it has almost kind of a Latin rock feel. And then the final track on the record is Ferris Wheel by the dollar store Bob Dylan himself, Donovan. It's the only pop cover on the whole record. It's not super exciting, but it's still a pretty good track. While Gabor Szabo's 1960s output deserves investigation by pretty much any fan of music, this record is as close as he ever got, I think, to putting out a flawless LP. It is a fantastic mix of classical, jazz, and psychedelia. But you needn't classify it as any particular genre to enjoy it, and on top of that, it is impeccably recorded, so it's a treat for audiophiles. If you haven't heard it, do yourself a favor, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.